And we just had a little glitch that cut off the recording for a second, but we're back, and this is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. And my guest is Cyndi O'Meara, who's a nutritionist, filmmaker, creator of What's with Wheat, which is currently on Netflix, and I really, really strongly recommend that you watch it. This is a powerful, frightening movie, really, about something that you probably, unless you have a gluten-free diet, eat every day. Her website is changinghabits.com. And let's pick up where we left off.
.au.
.au. Oh, you need .au to get to it?
Okay. Yeah, you got to get, if you go to .com, you end up at a nappy service, so you want to come to .au.
So, changinghabits.com.au.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah. So before the break, we were talking about how the rise in Roundup and specifically the active ingredient glyphosate, how that rise coincided with rises with many other diseases. And one of the things that happens is that we are destroying our bacteria in our gut. So we've destroyed it not only with antibiotics, because we know this. We know that broad-spectrum antibiotics does disturb the bacteria in our gut. But we've also destroyed it with other medications, with the food that we consume, the refined foods that we consume. But the most insidious of all, I believe, and so does Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's on the movie, and many of the other ones do as well. So Vandana Shiva talks about it. So does Dr. Perlmutter. When we're killing that bacteria that helps us digest our food, then we're in trouble. And Roundup is one of those ones. So the practice of desiccation. So what's desiccation? Desiccation is where we spray Roundup on a grain of, on the wheat field, or it could be the canola field. It depends on, as long as it's not Roundup ready genetically modified food, if we spray Roundup on that product, what it does is it kills that grain or that seed or whatever it is and makes it sprout more grain, so your yield is higher, but it kills a lot of the stem. Easy harvest, high yield, but then that Roundup and that active ingredient glyphosate is still within the seed or the grain, and we're eating it on a regular basis.
Okay, so
think about canola oil.
So when we're talking about wheat that has Roundup on it, this is GMO wheat.
No, that's, so they use Roundup on genetically modified foods and crops all the time because it resists Roundup. But if it's not genetically modified, the Roundup will kill it. And only 3 weeks before harvest they do this. Sprout more grain, higher yield. So it's the same. They're using Roundup on crops that aren't genetically modified, and they're using them on crops that are genetically modified. So everyone thought it was just Roundup ready soya, Roundup ready canola, Roundup ready whatever it was. But it's not anymore. It's they're spraying it on many of our crops. In here on the Sunshine Coast, I've been trying to stop the use of Roundup and glyphosate.
Good luck.
We have strawberry fields everywhere. People, young kids, go picking strawberries every season. They're allowed to go and pick them. It's pick your own strawberries. When the season is finished, they spray Roundup on the strawberry plants to kill them off, to be ready to plant into cleaner soil, as they think, cleaner soil, the next season. But Roundup can last up to 20 years in some soils. Not all soils, but in some soils it can last up to 20 years. So what are those soils? So what we're doing is, since the increased use of Roundup, we're getting more and more gut issues. So now we see people with not only celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, fructose malabsorption, bloated, SIBO, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, colitis. So all of these, these are all growing at an unbelievable rate. More and more people have gut issues than we've ever seen before.
And so this is Roundup. I mean, what percentage of wheat has Roundup related to it, used on it, or is GMO?
Well, not GMO, but definitely hybridized and GMO on it. Well, it will depend on the area.
In the United States? How about in the United States?
In the US, probably most of it.
How about Australia?
In Australia, parts of Australia, and the reason why is that we have wet and dry areas. So if it's a wet area, they'll usually use glyphosate. If it's a very dry area, such as maybe down in South Australia, they won't use the glyphosate. So it will depend on the environment.
Is there wheat that people can eat that is okay?
Well, that's the really good news, is that there are wheat farmers that have realized what is happening and what has happened to their farms. And they're cleaning up their farms, and they are actually starting to grow the old-fashioned wheats, such as einkorn, emmer wheat, kamut. I know these sound like foreign names, but these are our wheat grains. Kamut and spelt.
What about oats? There's another grain, oats.
Oats. Well, they do the same thing to oats. They will want to increase their yield, and they may very well use Roundup as a desiccant. Yeah, I know.
How about organic?
No, organic, you're fine. Organic, they would not do that. Roundup is not a certified organic spray to use. We have certified organic sprays that we can use.
They're working on it, I'm sure. So, but from what I got from the video, you don't want people to eat any grains.
No, I because if you listen to Sally Fallon at the end, she says, let's go back to our old-fashioned grains. Let's eat, let's eat the grains of our ancestor, but let's do it properly. Let's do the old ferments, the old breads, instead of the 2-hour breads where you get the wheat out of a bag, you mix it with yeast and a couple of other ingredients, you rise it, and then you throw it in the oven. And in actual fact, many of our breads have preservatives in it, have all sorts of ingredients other than what should be in it, which is 4 or 5 ingredients. So,
and how was it done back when it took longer? What was the process then when it wasn't?
So what we used to do is we used to make a slurry of water and the ground wheat that we would grind with rocks or look, I've been in Asia. I've hiked through Asia where I've heard every morning them grinding the corn or grinding the grain that they have. And then what they do is they make a slurry. And a slurry is made with the freshly ground grain with water. And then it sits for about 3 days and it starts to ferment. It starts to bubble. And then what they do with that is that they'll either add more wheat to it and more water to it, and then they might add a little bit of fat to it and a bit of salt to it. And then they'll do the same thing. They'll let it rise. So it's the consistency of, before you bake your bread, it's the consistency of your dough. So then they let that rise. They may punch it down, rise it for another couple of days. Then they will bake it. So this is due to culture. So culture enabled us to survive, adapt to environments and food. It was culture, traditions, and stories. They didn't have writing back then. Everything was a test. What's working, what's not. We notice when we consume this food, we don't get sick. The South American tribes say the plants talk to them. So there were these cultures.
The Native Americans.
Sorry, the South American tribes say that
the Native Americans, the indigenous people who were here before Columbus arrived. They say
they ate corn. They were corn growers. Yeah. So they had a type of agriculture as well, Rob.
Oh yeah.
Mm. So this is the way we used to do it. Now, think about it. we are an evolutionary body. We're not a modern body. We're a body that's evolved from, way back, thousands and thousands of generations. We haven't changed in the last 50 years genetically. And so our body is expecting information from food. So food is not just about how we grow and as an energy source. It's not just about that. It's actually a communicator, we're finding out, with our DNA. Our DNA is old. It doesn't know how to communicate with
not
additives.
only communicating with our DNA, it's communicating with our gut flora and the bacteria and all of the billions of organisms that live within us and keep us alive and healthy.
Exactly. And when we feed those bugs and we feed ourselves with foods that are modern day foods,
they suck.
We get sick. It's so simple, but nobody's looking at the historical perspective. If we look at the historical perspective of all these cultures, of the history with our bodies, the foods that we ate, the sunshine that we got, the sleep that we got, the rhythm that we were in with seasons, all of these things were our way of adapting to environments, of surviving, catastrophic things that happened from lack of food. So when we had lack of food, our body would use a different energy source. So we are the most amazing machines. And if we treat it the way that it used to be treated, then our body will work for us. I'm 57 this year, and I live by the principles of our cultures and our traditions, but I live in a modern world. I fly in planes. I live in a beautiful home. I drive a car, but I make sure this evolutionary body still thinks it's living a couple of 300 years ago. I don't want it to think that it lives in this environment right now, because this environment right now, and the food that we consume and the way we have lights on, and the way we don't get out in the sun and we think the sun is bad for us is what is the real biggest issue of all.
I was going to say it's the most toxic environment in the history of the human race.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So I want to take a step back, because I call the show Bottom Up Show. And you got me thinking about some things. You mentioned in the movie about monoculture, and I think that's how most wheat is probably grown now, in huge, massive farms where they get rid of everything else. I imagine there are probably some countries that the only thing they grow is wheat, and that you could go for miles and just see wheat. And that is a centralized form of production. To me, hierarchy is one of the main forms of top-down. Centralization is another main form of top-down. Domination is another form. Getting rid of diversity is another aspect of top-down. And what we're seeing with the wheat is all of that. This is top-down food, really, that is designed to be easier to mass produce, mass market, and quickly cook. So this conversation made me realize I'd have to add something to my list of top-down elements, and that's fast.
Yes.
Another thing is big. Big is another aspect of top-down. Bottom-up is smaller and local. And I think that we've really got to consider that one other aspect that takes us back to our ancestral nest. If you haven't seen her work, check out Darsha Narvaez and her neurobiology of the development of human morals. I love her work.
Yeah.
And basically, I think that's another piece of it. It's slow. Cooking is, we got rid of cooking. We've got fast foods. We had TV dinners, one of the most disgusting, vile forms of, quote, nutrition ever to exist. And I think that now we've got to I think what you're telling us is that you can't do this anymore. You've got to respect what your DNA needs. One of the aspects that was briefly mentioned in your movie is, oh boy, I forgot the name, epigenetics.
Yeah.
Epigenetics basically is, my example for epigenetics is you take a redwood, 3 redwood seeds, you plant one in a cup of sand, leave it alone, nothing happens. Take another, add water to the cup of sand, and it grows, but it's stunted because it doesn't have the nutrients. I think that's what our modern food is in an awful lot of ways. You take another one and you plant it deep in a forest, and it grows 300 feet tall and lives for 1,000 years. And we have the DNA to do the 300-foot tall, 1,000-year redwood tree, metaphorically, within ourselves. But what we're doing with our food is we're taking that cup of sand and adding some water to it. It's a lot easier to do a cup of sand. And the thing is, epigenetics basically tells us that there is a genetic potential for something within us to be healthy, to be alert, to be energetic, to resist disease. And when the epigenetic potential is blocked, is repressed, or is never fully potentiated, then you don't get there. And you end up with a sick person or a person who lost what they had. So this is part of this concept that I think you're talking about, right?
Yeah, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. You said it beautifully. And a lot of people don't understand, what that whole epigenetics is. But it's not just the food that you consume, but it's the environment you're in. It's the connections you have with people. So it's all encompassing with what is happening to you. So it's the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food that you consume, the things you put on your skin, the people that you love or don't. It's how we think. There's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bruce Lipton. He wrote the book, The Biology of Belief. So he talks about thoughts and our genes, and how we can turn genes on and off as a result of our thoughts. Another person
tells me, I used to run conferences on the brain, and he came and attended my conference, and I never really got a chance to pick his brain. I have to follow up on that. I missed an opportunity there.
Well, you should contact him, because I'm sure he would do an interview. And the other one is Joe Dispenza. Joe and Bruce came to Australia together back in the 90s, I think it was. And I went to their conference and bought their books. And now, I follow them both. Bruce comes out every year to the Southern Hemisphere and teaches chiropractic students all about this. He's amazing. And Joe comes every year as well. So they're two people that have really nailed our thoughts and our genetics. So when, I was talking to my husband, I must tell you, I was talking to my husband yesterday, and, I was saying we're having a situation here in Australia where there's a bit of medical tyranny happening with a family, where a young boy has been taken from them because they're feeding them organic foods and medical cannabis to stop his seizures, which have stopped 45 days without a seizure. But the medical profession, or I don't know if it's the medical profession or the government institution, aren't happy with organic foods and cannabis, and have taken this young boy away from him, away from the family. So I said to my husband, this is why we have our farm, so that if our grandchildren, because all my children are grown, if our grandchildren are in trouble, we can put them on the farm. And then he says to me, don't think that way, Cyndi. Just think that this is a place that we're going to bring up our grandchildren, show them how food is grown, and think differently. And this is epigenetics. It's not only about what you eat, or your environment, but is very much based on your thoughts. And one of the things that we live in this Western world on is fear. Everybody's fearful. Everyone's scared of some bug or virus or I don't know, everyone's scared of everything. And when I talk to people, aren't you scared, Cyndi, that if you don't do this, this might happen? I go, no, not at all.
Well, that's a vicious cycle, because the epigenetics of moral development, if you don't develop fully epigenetically with the pathways that need to develop and the neural and hormonal elements don't fully bloom, then you're scared. Then you tend to have more of a stress and a fear response. So it's a vicious cycle. But I want to continue because we're running out of time. And a number of your experts in your documentary make it really clear that it's not even the gut stuff. It's not even the celiac and the Crohn's disease that are the biggest issue. It's neurological. It's nervous system. So we better cover that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's oh wow, there's so much science behind that whole documentary, and when you look at the science and then try and succinctly put it in. But what I'll do is I'll succinctly put this in. So what we talked about the destruction of the bacteria. Therefore, when we eat wheat, we can't digest the protein. The protein breaks into something called gliadin. Gliadin is one of the things in this world, as well as pathological bacteria, that opens the gates of our intestinal lining to allow undigested proteins, bacteria, whatever is in the gut, to pass through into our blood system.
That's called a leaky gut?
That's called a leaky gut. And then the immune system wakes up and says, something's in the body, let's get rid of it, creates an antibody to it. And then from there, that antibody, if you continue to eat that food and there continues to be a problem, it will go generally all over the body. That antibody will then start to find proteins that look like that gliadin, and it could find that protein, because we're made up of proteins, it could find it in the thyroid, it could find it in our joints, it could find it in the pancreas. That's when our beta cells get killed and we have type 1 diabetes. So it could attack any organ or system in the body.
So you're saying wheat leads to leaky gut, which leads to a whole variety of different autoimmune problems?
Definitely. That's it. It's succinctly. But one of the things that it seems to affect the most is our nervous system. So the nervous system, as probably everybody knows from listening to you, is the brain and also right through our spine and all the nerves to our little fingers. And so, Dr. Rodney Ford, who's a gastroenterologist and a pediatrician, he was the one who said that it affects our nervous system, because sometimes as soon as you eat wheat, the result is instant with symptoms. And he says that can't happen from just having celiac disease. It's got to be neurologically based. And we're seeing that with multiple sclerosis. We're seeing it with Parkinson's. So we're seeing ataxia. We're seeing multiple people with multiple nervous system problems. And as they study these problems, they're realizing that it's gluten that has something to do with the leaky gut, which then causes those issues, not only in the nervous system, but in many systems, and including the blood system. They've even related it to heart disease. Now, do I believe, as Dr. Terry Walls talks about, do I believe it's the only thing? No. It's an etiology of many things. It's what we've created, and now we've got the straw that's breaking the camel's back. That's basically what's happening at the moment, and wheat is a big part of that.
Now, I was talking to somebody, a close friend, who says that she eats Ezekiel bread, which is a certain brand of bread that's sprouted, organic. Does that make a difference? Does that help?
It's a Bible bread, Ezekiel bread. It is definitely. It's a Bible bread. It's from the Bible. Ezekiel was. And that's where you get the recipe from. And in actual fact, when I wrote my book, Changing Habits, Changing Lives, back in 1998, I put a recipe in there for Ezekiel bread, because I had heard about it, and it was in the Bible, and I kind of figured, well, maybe it's got some truth in it. So it was a mix of grains and legumes that was sprouted. And by sprouting, then the sprouting reduces all the anti-nutrients that might be in the grain or the legume. And so if it's a fully sprouted bread and there's been no glyphosate sprayed on it, then by all means, Ezekiel bread is a wonderful bread, as long as it's the traditionally made Ezekiel bread.
What does that mean? With the long time?
It has to be, if they're going to do it, they got to do the long one. They got to do the ferment as well. Even though it's sprouted, they've still got to do the ferment and the sour. It's like a sourdough, an old-fashioned artisan sourdough. And you know what? In Australia, and I've seen it in the US and in England, there are bakers going back to their artisan ways, which I absolutely love.
That's cool. So now you talked about gluten, and there's this massive explosion of gluten-free foods available in stores now. What's the story with them? Because in the documentary, it says they have some problems too.
Yeah. So not all gluten-free foods, because there are some very ethical manufacturers out there. But because gluten and wheat has become a problem, then food manufacturers have seen it a way of making money. They're not necessarily nutritionists. They're not necessarily out there to kill us, but they don't know. And so when I read the ingredients of these gluten-free foods that are made by large manufacturers, what I see is a bunch of fillers and binders and additives and preservatives and sugars and glucose-based sugars even. And, and one of the things like Dr. Rodney Ford talks about in the movie, he says in the US at the moment, they're not even, it's not a food that's gluten-free can have parts per million. I think it's 20 parts per million is allowed in a gluten-free product. So it's not even gluten-free. So if somebody who is very sensitive to gluten eats those gluten-free foods, it may set off an inflammatory response. It may set off something that can affect their autoimmune disease or their nervous system. So I'd be very, very careful of eating any gluten-free foods unless you knew that it was zero gluten, or unless you made it yourself. And I think if we get back into the kitchen, males and females, if we start getting back into the kitchen, prepare our foods from scratch, we've been to the farmer's market, we've got everything fresh, either chemical-free or organic, or we're growing it ourselves, which is not hard, or we have a community garden somewhere, which are sprouting up everywhere, then we start to feed our family and we will start to heal the nation. But until that happens...
Garden for... Where does the community garden fit into this?
Oh, so community gardens here in Australia and in England, and I've seen them in America as well, is it's where communities have got together and they've been given a patch of land by the council and they can grow vegetable gardens. So instead of one person growing a vegetable garden for themselves, it's a group of the community that have a passion for growing, and they go in there and they grow food within an area. There's a gentleman, his name is not coming to me at the moment, but he's known as the Renegade Gardener, and he's in LA. And what he's done is he's pulled up pathways, like your verges, your grass verges. So he's pulled up them.
That's not an American term. Is that like a sidewalk, the grass on the sidewalk, something like that?
Yep. The grass on the sidewalk, he's pulled that up and he's planted foods. And he calls where he lives at the moment, before he started this vegetable patches, he called it a food desert, because all it had was all the takeaway places, from McDonald's to Kentucky Fried to Wendy's to all of them. And he said, let's create gardens. And all he had was sidewalk grass. And so he pulled all of that up, and this is in LA, and created veggie gardens and fruit trees, and it's no longer a food desert. And a lot of the youth are coming out to help him. So this is what's happening because of the top side up theory, We're getting
Top
your theory of, topside down, sorry.
down.
We're going bottom up. And there are people out there with real passion. So in my town, there's a gentleman by the name of Duncan. And Duncan one day decided that he didn't have enough land in his little land plot that he has with his house on it. So he started to grow land on his sidewalk grass.
Growing vegetables,
and then his neighbours said, we'd like to do what you're doing, and they've done it. There are 7 blocks, and they call it Urban Street, where you can go and pick bananas, lettuces, herbs, tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet potato, lemons, oranges. It's the most amazing place. And it just started with one man going, oh, I'm just going to put food out on my nature strip. So
now the community gardens I'm familiar with, and they generally have a bunch of people who each get a little plot, and then they grow their stuff for themselves. It doesn't sound like that's what you're talking about here.
No, I'm talking about communities getting together to create gardens. Like in England, they have allotments, but in Australia here, we have community gardens, and you're getting the same thing happening within your world. There are people that are doing community gardens within townships.
I know. I help with one, and they require that the soil be organic and the plants be organic, which is great, really. But they also put a fence around it, and because people tend to pilfer and take, the little bit that's grown there. And
we talk about in the movie Todmorden, which is in England, and I've been to Todmorden, and what they've done is that they grow food trees. They have, and none of it's fenced off, and the community is allowed to eat it. So I think it depends on the community you're in. It's really sad that you think you've got to put a fence around it and lock it. I did notice last time I was in New York, which was only a couple of weeks ago, that was happening in New York. Whereas I
know my brother was in one, and he would tend the garden, and he would work, and he would contribute his time overall to the full community garden. And he had his little plot, and he had his tomato plants that grew the big heirloom tomatoes, and he would wait till they got bigger and bigger, and then the next day when he's ready to pick it, it's gone, and there are only 3 tomatoes on the plant. So that kind of thing, I guess that's the psychology behind it. So I know most of the people who in this other one that I'm in were involved with. Last year they grew the big tomatoes, and because the tomatoes are the biggest item to be taken, and they grew baby tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, and little tomatoes. So, and then it doesn't matter so much because they grow hundreds of them.
This is the mentality that has been going on for hundreds and thousands, well, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of years and thousands of years. Yes. In agriculture. We could have learned
hoard the food.
Yep, hoard the food. We could have learned so much from our beautiful Australian Aboriginal people who did not have that mentality. And we destroyed that understanding and of how they did that. How did they grow crops and not fear their neighbours would take their crops? How did they only take so much fish to allow the people down the river to eat the other, have the fish? Because they had, the Aboriginal people had fish farms. They had these, or fish traps, I should call them. And they had a sophisticated way of only taking some and allowing some for the people.
The problem is when you start having land, you guard it, you create a hierarchy. The guards are near the bottom, and the people who tell the guards what to do are near the top. And then farmers are probably closer to the bottom, except the landowners. And you end up with this hierarchical system that is self-reinforcing. And that's part of the problem too. And that's what made civilization with all the hierarchy and centralization that is so much a part of it. But we're going to wrap up, and the part that we don't have yet is, what do we all do? We've listened to this conversation, watched your movie. What do we do? what do I have for dinner?
I know that's always a problem. So number one is education. Number two is deciding whether you want to act on that education. And, I've been doing this for 33 years, and I created a program called 6 Weeks, No Wheat, where I give you recipes, ideas, and it's online. So you don't have to buy a book or anything like that. You just can go and you can actually go to the website whatswithwheat.com or changinghabits.com.au, and you will see the 6 Week No Wheat. But if people want to do what I did, which was the 4-phase fat elimination, which is also on that website, then that really changes your taste buds, changes the way you think about food, educates your body about what's right for it and what's wrong for it. So if you're starting out, I would suggest the 6 Week No Wheat. Just give it a go. See what happens. You can't do tests for non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is all of those maladies that you have when you eat wheat, even though you don't have celiac disease. You can't do tests. So just go off it for 6 weeks. Start with that. And then if you're finding that you're still not where you would like to be, then enter into the 4-phase fat elimination, where you eliminate, except for the foods of the hunter-gatherer, winter hunter-gatherer, and then slowly introduce. We have coaches, we have people helping you through that. But the 6 Week No Wheat, you should be able to do by yourself. And we then teach you in that 6 Week No Wheat, it's not just about a diet, it's an education about the food, like from gluten-free foods to how do I find traditional wheats, to what's bread made up of these days. So there is a whole education behind the diet. It's not just a diet.
One thing about meat, aren't the cows and the pigs that you get meat from fed wheat?
Yeah. That has been sprayed in glyphosate, and they'll be eating soya and corn. That could be BT corn and soy and Roundup ready soya. I'm very particular about my flesh foods, including my poultry, my fowl, my poultry, and my red meat, as well as my fish. So I won't eat farm fish. I'll only have wild. I have grass-fed meat. I go to my local farmers markets. I get my grass-fed meat. I know my farmers, and I have a farm myself that grows cows. So I haven't butchered any of my cows because they're still growing. But and I have chickens. So I get all my eggs from my chickens. But for those people who don't have that, then you go to your farmers markets. You talk to your farmers. You find out what they're feeding them. You see if they're organic and free-range chickens that are having a ball.
Going local.
Local, be seasonal, and you watch. It's out there. People are starting to do this, and I found it in New York when I was there. When I met you a couple of weeks ago, there were places that I went to that, like a very, very fast takeaway store called Dig In. DIGGINN. There's like 15 takeaway places, and they do ethical meats, ethical greens and vegetables. They were amazing. So even in New York, you don't even have to grow your food. You can actually eat out, which I know is that culture. So it's there. You just have to hunt it out and find it, and keep your ears and eyes open and ask people, and you will find where you can get this good quality food.
All right, some good advice. And again, the website for the 6-week program is whatswithwheat.com. And it's clear that this just doesn't apply to wheat, really. It applies to almost all the food that we eat, right?
Yeah, the story of wheat is a story of food.
Yeah.
And that's the scary part of this. But once you become educated and you act on it, you watch your health change. I have seen people's health change very dramatically by really considering how their food is produced and how they consume their food and how they live their lifestyle. Okay.
I think anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I think we've just about said it all. Thank you, Rob. That was brilliant. You had some fabulous questions.
Well, thank you. Great answers and again, what's with wheat? If you go to Netflix, just do the search and type in what's with, and it'll show up. And it's really worth watching it. Thank you so much.